Imagine being sued by your own father. This was the reality facing Melbourne journalist Mimi Kwa when her larger-than-life father Francis took her to the Australian Supreme Court. It was that moment that started a journey for Mimi. She needed to understand her father and reflect on her sometimes painful family history. And the result is an extraordinary memoir. It's called House of Kwa. And Mimi joins me now from Melbourne. Good morning.
Good morning, Francesca. It's brilliant to be on your show. Thank you.
Tell me, what drove you to write this book?
Well, exactly as you said, my father sued me in the Supreme Court, and I actually went grey, literally, overnight, Marie Antoinette style, and I was so stressed out by this event because up until that point I'd had actually very good relations with my dad, and so it came as such a shock that I sort of went into a bit of a grief pattern, I suppose, and for want of a better word, I had a bit of a mental breakdown, or an emotional breakdown at least. And during that period of the court battle, I started to journal and I started to sort of try to get my feelings out onto the page. And that journaling sort of turned into story writing. And what I realised was I was actually trying to excavate the past of my family's history and my dad's history to try to work out what made him the type of man who would sue his own daughter. And then as the story unfolded on the page and started to pour out of me, I actually was on an exploration of what made me the sort of woman who would stand up to her father. So it was such a cathartic sort of practice, and it was sort of a healing for me in a way. And I didn't realise in the beginning of my writing that it was going to turn into a book, but somewhere along the journey it started to, and now we've got House of Kwa.
We'll come back to Francis in just a moment because he is such a fascinating character. But how important is it to preserve our family stories?
I cannot recommend it more highly. I've spoken to so many people who lament the fact that their family stories have been all but forgotten because nothing's ever been scribed, nothing's ever been recorded, and the elders of the family are either so old that they don't recall their own childhoods very well or any of the detail of their formative years, or they have already passed on to the other side. So I just urge anybody who has, even if it's skeletons in the closet. I mean, I know that it's difficult to confront these sorts of things, and there is such a thing as inherited trauma that I'm sure that we're all aware of, and often we put things, we slide things, brush things under the carpet, or we compartmentalise things and put them in a shoebox and put them on a shelf and think, oh, well, I'll deal with that later or never. But I do highly recommend making the time and giving yourself the space to actually sit with the elders in your family and hear their stories, and actually sit with yourself and be honest about your own story. And when I say that, I don't say that lightly, because I know that when people have experienced the type of childhood traumas that I have, or worse, or even not to that degree, whatever it is that you've experienced in your life, everybody has had a degree of trauma or upset or a difficult relationship with somebody. And so if you are going to sit with that and try to come to terms with that and deal with that for the first time in your life, I suggest getting the proper support, seeing a counsellor or a psychologist, or having close family support around you when you do sort of explore those areas that you may have, like I did for so many years of my journalism, that you may have run away from. Because a lot of my journalist career was running away from my past and thinking that by running away and building a career and a life for myself, that some of these demons would be put to rest. And in my experience, I've found that that's never the case. It's always with you until you deal with it.
And this book is a gift for your kids, isn't it?
It is in part. I mean, they won't read it yet because there are some tricky things in there.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Young readers. Yeah, absolutely. And I thought long and hard before publishing the book. It's been a 5-year writing journey, including sort of a year of editing and getting it to the stage where it's ready for readers. And I did sit with it, and I did wonder for a long time whether or not I should publish, because my children are not of an age to actually read some of the material in it. But what I do is I sit with the kids. I've got 4 children, and they are 10, 13, 15 and 17. Now, the 17-year-old is old enough to deal with some of the themes in the book, and he will read it at some stage when he's ready, and we have discussed some of what's in there. But for the younger ones, I actually sit with them by the fire and I just read it to them and self-censor and edit as I'm reading. So it's actually, and another thing that I discussed with the kids is I said, well, when Nicole Kidman or Russell Crowe or somebody does a movie that's, say, M-rated or deals with some grown-up themes, they don't show their kids the movie. That's their professional work, and I know that that's not necessarily their life story, and this is my life story, but I kind of see it like that, and I feel that I'm able to be balanced enough in the family situation, and the kids are able to be balanced enough to understand that there are some tricky things that, we will come to later in, our family discussions.
And maybe gives you a little time to work out how you're going to deal with those conversations, because there's going to be some interesting conversations. Do your children, have they had the same experience as you growing up as mixed heritage in Australia?
No, not at all. So my husband is Caucasian, and by way of background, my mum is Caucasian, but my dad is full Chinese, and so I grew up Eurasian in Australia, so really, half, but also very cross-culturally Eurasian in that I had, a Chinese household, and my parents were divorced when I was quite young, and I had an English household because my mum lived with her parents who were very British, and we had carpeted bathrooms, and we weren't allowed to take our shoes off in the house, and we had the steamed vegetables and roast every night for dinner, which was lovely. But it was very traditional English and then very traditional Chinese. So I had that dichotomy, whereas my children, even just physically, biologically, they don't really look very Chinese, and I do look Asian. And I have one of my children probably looks more Asian than the others. Like, she's a spitting image of me when I was her age. But they haven't had that because even though they have, 2 of my boys have Chinese middle names, Jindong and Jinfu, which means lucky gold and gold of the East, and they say to me, Mum, I don't feel very Chinese. And I said, well, I know, but it's still in your blood and it's still in your bones and it's still your heritage, and one day you might want to know more about it. So I don't live a particularly traditionally Chinese life. I live probably more than anything, more of a mainstream Australian life, but with the, this undercurrent of the British and Chinese heritage. But my children, generationally, as with all of our kids, I hope, are growing up in a fairly colourblind generation where they don't see colour or race or sexuality or difference or diversity of any sort as being an issue. It's just very natural for them to not discriminate, which I just think it floors me, and I think it's wonderful. It's so wonderful.
And the differences between generations is something that you do actually explore in this book, because of course we learn so much about Francis, your father, who was born in China but sort of grew up in Hong Kong when the Japanese invaded during World War II. And he was one of 32 children, and, a generation later, you're an only child.
Yeah, that's extraordinary, isn't it? I grew up knowing that my dad was one of 32 brothers and sisters, and as with all of us, you grow up in whatever environment you grow up in, whatever family story you are born into, and it's normalised. So I just thought, 32 brothers and sisters, although I didn't have 32 brothers and sisters, but I thought, well, that must have just been the norm in China and Hong Kong, which it wasn't terribly unusual to have a vast number of siblings, but 32 was still quite extraordinary. Even Chinese people, look at me and think, wow, their eyes widen. But my entire life, telling people that my father came from such a big family, jaws would drop and people would want to hear the story. So I think from very early on, long before this book ever, came to life, I knew that there was a story there in the family history, but I just hadn't gotten around to writing it, and maybe I never would have if my dad hadn't taken me to court and I didn't go through that sort of emotional roller coaster journey.
And we should probably just explain briefly why your father took you to court, and you didn't see it as personal. Is that right?
Well, I did at the time. So the reason I went grey over the night, the reason I went through a little bit of an emotional breakdown, or a lot of an emotional breakdown, was because I was taking it very personally. But it was through the writing, because I thought, he used to paint my tricycle when I was a little girl. He'd wheel my piano to school so that I could play at school concerts. He'd throw birthday parties for me. He was he was very unconventional, as you will know from having read the book, but he was a loving, caring father in his own way, and we had a strong relationship, and I just couldn't reconcile how he could just be so dispassionate as to take me to court out of the blue, which was over the estate of my late auntie, my Aunt Teresa, who was his dear sister as well. So I did take it personally, but through writing the book and exploring his past and the sort of childhood that he must have had growing up during the Japanese brutal occupation of Hong Kong for 3 years and 8 months, during which time the Allied forces bombed Hong Kong no fewer than 52 times over that period, friendly fire, in inverted commas, which, also brought casualties of the Hong Kong people. So he lived through that. And that must have been just so confronting and so hard. And I can understand now why he became the survivor and the fighter that he has become. So through writing the story, which I highly recommend to anybody, if you write your family story, whether it becomes a book or not, doesn't matter. It's just the process of writing that helps you come to a greater understanding of the people in your family, but also of yourself. So in writing the story, I came to understand that it wasn't personal.
Is Francis still a hoarder, Mimi?
He is. There's sort of this very, complex system of getting into his property. When I go to Perth to see him, there are pulleys and levers, and then, you might go to the wrong door to go in and find that he's got, students and tenants living in one part of the house, and then you go around to the other part of the house, and there he is with his little setup. He'll have he's like Inspector Gadget in some ways too. He hoards things because in his mind he does have a use for them. He'll have a mirror set up that will reflect the light from a globe that is, instead of the light globe in the ceiling, he'll have that too, but he'll have a light globe set into the wall that will then send light to the mirror, and he has the mirror on an exact angle that the light will then reflect onto his newspaper exactly where he likes to put it on the table so that he can read it under the perfect light. And he'll have his magnifying glass that will be in his pocket, attached to a cord, attached to a chain around his neck, with a couple of different types of reading glasses.
Oh, bless him! And he was
and
such.
That's if you can get into the house.
He was
crocodile and the things.
You've written him so beautifully. You've got such a strong sense of him, and the book is non-fiction, but it is written like a novel. Why did you decide on this style?
I think that's how I write, because I always loved to write short stories ever since I was a little girl. And perhaps I've just had, so many years, 20 years as a journalist writing, short, pithy news-type sentences, that it's a real joy and a pleasure to depart from that and write in these more descriptive, whimsical, magical sentences that really take you to the place and put you in that scene. So that was one reason that I like to write in, almost fictionally. But another reason that helped me with my confidence in that was Trent Dalton's book, Boy Swallows Universe, which, if you've read it, it is just written so beautifully. And it is a fiction. It is a fictional book. It's a novel, but anybody who's read it and has done a bit of research around it would know that Trent Dalton, the author, has based it on his life. At least 50% of it is true. And I sort of thought, when I was in the writing process, well, I think this is okay. It gave me I was already writing in that style, but it gave me that added confidence to think, well, this is going to be enjoyable for the reader. It's certainly enjoyable for me to write this way. And so I went with it. And it just seemed to pour out onto the page. You know, it's like when you're in flow with something that you love doing, even though there were lots of times during the writing process where it was difficult to write about certain things. But I was just in flow and I loved it, and I hope that you love it too.
Oh, well, I have. I've very much enjoyed it. So thank you so much for putting your story onto pages, and wonderful to talk to you today. That was Mimi Kwa, who is the author of House of Kwa. And I tell you what, if you are heading away these holidays and you happen to have a bit of spare time on your hands, this is a really great book to pass the time. Thoroughly enjoyed it. You know, if you enjoyed Wild Swans or Educated, then this is a book for you.